The crown was still warm from her head when he placed it on another woman's. Leora stood in the center of the great hall of Valdric Keep, surrounded by 400 wolves in their finest silks and leathers, and felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The chandelier light caught the silver circlet as it left her hair, and for one absurd, detached moment, she noticed a strand of her own dark hair still caught in the metalwork. A piece of her, clinging to the thing being taken away. She would remember that detail later. The way the strand caught the candlelight as it was carried away from her. Such a small thing to carry into the wreckage of a life. King Theron Valdric stood at the center of the dais, his jaw set in that particular way that meant he had made a decision and cemented it into something immovable. She knew that jaw. She had memorized every version of it across dining tables and throne rooms and long, silent corridors for 3 years. The jaw when he was deliberating. The jaw when he was commanding. The jaw when he had already decided and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. This was the third one. The worst one. By the ancient right of sovereign claim, his voice carried through the hall without effort, deep and commanding and utterly devoid of hesitation. I dissolve the bond of Luna from Leora Ashvane and bestow it upon Lysara Dane, who shall stand beside me as the heart of this empire. The heart of this empire. The hall was silent except for the faint crackle of the hearth fires and the sound of Leora's heartbeat, which had become so loud she was certain the wolves in the back row could hear it. He crossed to her. His fingers were steady as he lifted the Luna's crown from her head. He did not look at her as he did it. He turned from her like she was a door he was closing. Lysara Dane stood at the base of the dais in a gown of deep crimson, her golden hair cascading over bare shoulders, her chin lifted at exactly the right angle to catch the light. She looked like she had been rehearsing this moment in a mirror, probably because she had. The court already knew. Leora could see it in their faces. The way certain nobles leaned forward with anticipation rather than confusion. The way Lysara's father, Lord Aldrich Dane, stood near the front with his arms folded and his expression carefully, deliberately neutral. This had been arranged, negotiated, sealed in private rooms over wine and ambition, while Leora had been walking the wardstones at dawn, oblivious. Theron descended the 3 steps and placed the crown on Lysara's head with both hands. Gentle, deliberate. The tenderness in the gesture hollowed out something vital behind Leora's ribs. Leora's hands hung at her sides. She did not clench them. She did not tremble. She breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth the way Mistress Sylveth had taught her during her first week in the capital, when the panic attacks had come every night like clockwork. 400 faces stared at her, some with pity, some with satisfaction, a few with the particular hunger of people who fed on the misery of others. Lysara's lips curved into a smile so faint it could almost be mistaken for grace. Almost. But Leora had spent 6 months watching that mouth whisper into the king's ear at every banquet, every council session, every private moment Leora was no longer invited to witness. She knew what that smile meant. It meant victory. "You may go," Theron said. He still wasn't looking at her. The words landed in the silence like a stone dropped into still water. "You may go." As if she were a servant being dismissed from a room, as if 3 years of walking wardstones and tending the sick and holding this palace together could be folded up and set aside with 2 words and a wave of the royal hand. Leora lifted her chin. She looked at him, just once, directly, not with anger, not with tears. She looked at him the way you look at someone who has broken something irreplaceable and doesn't know it yet. With pity. Something flickered across his face, a crack in the stone. He blinked, and it was gone. Leora turned and walked toward the great doors. Her shoes clicked against the marble, each step echoing in the silence. She did not run. She did not stumble. 400 wolves watched her cross the longest room in the empire, and not a single one of them spoke. She was 3 steps from the door when the floor cracked. Not a metaphor, not a trick of sound. The marble beneath her feet split with a sound like a bone breaking, a jagged line racing from where she stood toward the center of the hall. The hearth fires surged, flaring white-hot for a single, blinding second before guttering low. Someone gasped. A glass shattered somewhere to the left. One of the ancient ward stones flanking the entrance, carved granite pillars that had stood for 6 centuries, developed a fracture that ran from base to crown in the time it took to draw a breath. Leora didn't notice. She was already through the doors. Behind her, the hall erupted into confused murmurs. Theron stared at the crack in the floor, his expression unreadable. Lysara's smile had frozen on her face. By midnight, every wolf in the Valdric Empire felt it. It came as a pressure in the chest, a sudden hollowing, like the moment before a scream that never arrives. Wolves woke from sleep gasping. Children cried without knowing why. Elders clutched their chests and stumbled to their knees, overwhelmed by a grief that didn't belong to them, but had settled into their bones like frost. In the northern territories, the barrier shimmer that had protected the borders for generations flickered once, twice, and went dark. The air beyond it, which had always carried the faint electric hum of warded ground, went dead and silent. The earth shook. Not violently, not enough to topple buildings, but enough. A low, sustained tremor that rolled through the ground like a heartbeat stopping, like the land itself had gasped. In the great hall, the cracked wardstone crumbled to dust. It fell in on itself quietly, almost gently, the way something ancient surrenders when the last thing holding it together is finally removed. And the Alpha King, standing in the ruins of a celebration that should have been his triumph, his new Luna glittering beside him in borrowed silver, felt the first cold whisper of something he hadn't experienced in years. Fear. 3 years earlier, Leora Ashvane had been perfectly, blissfully invisible. She had lived in the border village of Thornfeld, a settlement so small it appeared on royal maps only as a dot without a name. She worked in the healing house, grinding herbs before dawn, treating burns and fevers and the occasional wolf who had misjudged a cliff face during a hunt. The work was steady. The days were quiet. Nobody looked at her twice, and she preferred it that way. She had been orphaned young, left on the steps of the healing house as an infant with nothing but a wool blanket and a name stitched into the hem in thread so fine it had nearly faded by the time anyone thought to look. Leora. No family name, no lineage, no packmark. Mistress Sylveth, the head healer, had raised her alongside poultice recipes and bone-setting techniques. Leora had grown up with steady hands and a quiet disposition, and the unshakable belief that her purpose in life was to be useful to others, because being useful was the only currency she had. She had never expected the root binding. The ritual happened once a generation, when the old magic of the Empire stirred and selected a Luna for the reigning Alpha. It was not a choice. It was not a courtship. The wardstones across the Empire would glow in sequence, and the light would travel from stone to stone until it found her, whoever she was, wherever she hid. Leora had been elbow-deep in a bowl of crushed feverfew when the wardstone outside the healing house erupted in light, so bright it burned through the shuttered windows. She remembered the heat of it on her skin, the way the light had wrapped around her wrists like shackles made of gold. She remembered thinking, very clearly, there has been a mistake. There had not been a mistake. The king's retinue arrived in Thornfeld 4 days later. Leora was escorted to the capital in a carriage she was afraid to sit in, wearing borrowed clothes that didn't fit, clutching a bag of dried lavender because the smell calmed her, and she had never been more terrified in her life. Theron Valdric met her in the throne room. He was tall in a way that seemed designed to make other people feel lesser, broad across the shoulders, narrow at the waist, with dark hair shorn close at the sides, and gray eyes that held all the warmth of a frozen lake. He looked at her for exactly 4 seconds. "This is the one?" he asked. Not to her. To Jorath, his beta, who stood 2 paces behind him with the carefully neutral expression of a man accustomed to standing near explosions. "The wardstones confirmed it, Your Majesty," Jorath replied. Theron's gaze returned to Leora. She felt it land on her like a weight, cataloging and dismissing in a single sweep. The borrowed dress, the calloused hands, the lavender she was crushing between her fingers so hard the oil was staining her skin. "Fine," he said. The word held the enthusiasm of a man accepting an unfavorable weather report. The bonding ceremony was 3 days later. Brief. Efficient. Theron spoke the words without looking at her, and when the ritual required him to take her hand, his grip was firm and impersonal, the handshake of a man closing a transaction. That night, alone in the Luna's chambers, a room so vast her entire healing house could have fit inside it, Leora sat on the edge of a bed meant for two and pressed her face into her lavender bag and tried very hard not to cry. She failed. But by morning she had wiped her face and straightened her spine and decided that if she couldn't be loved, she would be indispensable. She threw herself into the Luna's duties with the same steady determination she had brought to the healing house. She learned the wardstone maintenance rituals, walking the perimeter of the keep each dawn to lay her hands on the ancient stones and murmur the words she'd been taught. She tended the sick in the lower city. She managed the household accounts when the steward fell ill and discovered a talent for numbers she hadn't known she possessed. She resolved disputes among the servants with patience and fairness. She learned every name. The court tolerated her. The servants loved her. The king barely noticed she existed. Theron was not cruel. That was the insidious part. He was simply absent. He spoke to her at formal dinners with the same polite detachment he showed visiting dignitaries. He never raised his voice, never insulted her, never touched her beyond what ceremony required. He simply looked through her, as if she were a window he hadn't bothered to open. She tried in those early months. Left pressed wildflowers on his desk because she'd read somewhere that alphas responded to gestures of care. The flowers were always gone by the next morning, swept away by a servant, and she never knew if he'd even seen them. She learned his schedule, memorized the way he took his tea, anticipated his needs before he voiced them. None of it registered. She was efficient and invisible, and after a while, she stopped trying to be anything else. And then, 6 months ago, Lysara Dane arrived, noble-born, daughter of the Western Alpha, beautiful in the way that made rooms rearrange themselves around her. She walked into court like she already owned it, and within a week she was at Theron's side at every meal, every council meeting, every evening gathering. She laughed in a way that carried across the rooms, bright and musical, the kind of laugh that made people turn their heads. Theron turned his head too. Leora watched it happen, the way you watch a storm approaching from a long way off. You see it coming. You know what it means. But you stand there anyway, because where else would you go? The whispers came first. Then the pitying looks. Then the nights when Theron's chambers stayed lit long after Lysara had been seen walking toward them, her crimson cloak trailing behind her like a promise. Leora didn't confront him, didn't cry where anyone could see. She simply kept walking the wardstones at dawn, kept tending the sick, kept being useful, because being useful was the only thing she knew how to be. The night before the ball, Leora went to the sewing room to collect the ceremonial gown that had been altered for tomorrow's lunar ascension celebration. The door was ajar. Candlelight spilled into the corridor. She pushed it open and stopped breathing. Lysara stood before the tall mirror in the ceremonial Luna's gown. The silver-threaded silk caught the candlelight and scattered it like starfire. The dress had been fitted for Leora. She could see where the seams had been hastily taken in at the waist, let out at the bust. And behind her, his fingers working the laces at her back, with a gentleness Leora had never once felt directed at her, stood Theron. He was smiling. Leora had never seen him smile before. Not once in 3 years. Not at the Harvest Festival. Not at the winter solstice celebrations. Not on any of the 1,000 ordinary evenings she had spent across a table from him, hoping. His smile was devastating. It transformed his entire face, softened the granite of his jaw, lit something behind those cold gray eyes that she hadn't known existed. And it was aimed at another woman wearing Leora's dress. She stepped back from the doorway before either of them saw her, pressed her back against the cold stone wall, and felt the last fragile thing inside her chest. Finally, quietly, break. The morning of the Lunar Ascension Ball, Leora woke before dawn out of habit. Her body didn't know that today was the end of everything. It simply did what it always did. Rise, breathe, begin. She walked the wardstones one final time. The air was cold and sharp against her face as she crossed the inner courtyard. Frost clung to the cobblestones. The wardstones stood where they had always stood, 12 of them ringing the keep in a circle older than the Valdric dynasty itself. She pressed her palm against the first one and felt the familiar hum travel up her arm and settle in her chest, warm and steady, like a second heartbeat. She had never understood what the wardstones took from her. The ritual words she'd been taught were simple, almost childlike, and the sensation was so gentle she assumed it was symbolic. A tradition. A formality the Luna performed because someone had to. She didn't know that every morning for 3 years, she had been pouring her own life force into the stones, that the warmth she felt wasn't the stones giving to her. It was her giving to them. No one had told her, because no one alive remembered what a root-bound Luna actually was. Leora completed the circuit and returned to her chambers. She bathed. She dressed in her simplest gown, a deep blue wool with no embroidery, no silver thread, no ornament of any kind. She pinned her dark hair back from her face and looked at herself in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was calm, steady-eyed, pale, yes, thinner than she should have been, with shadows under her eyes that 3 years of loneliness had carved into something permanent, but calm. She didn't know why she felt calm. Maybe it was the numbness that comes after grief has been sustained so long it becomes architecture. Maybe it was something older and deeper, something her body understood that her mind hadn't caught up with yet. She walked into the great hall at exactly the appointed hour. The hall was magnificent. Hundreds of candles burned in the iron chandeliers, casting warm gold light across 400 faces turned toward the dais. Silk banners bearing the Valdric crest hung from the vaulted ceiling. Musicians played something stately and triumphant in the gallery above. Leora took her position at the right of the throne, where the Luna always stood during formal court. The crown sat on her head, lighter than people assumed. She had always thought that was fitting. The weight of being Luna had never been in the metal. Theron entered from the private corridor behind the dais. He was dressed in black and silver, his jaw set in stone, his gray eyes sweeping the room once before settling on a point above everyone's heads. He didn't look at Leora. He never looked at Leora. The ceremony began with the traditional blessings. Leora stood motionless, hands folded, breathing measured. She watched the crowd. She could see Girath near the front, his expression carefully blank in a way that told her he knew what was coming. He hadn't warned her. She didn't blame him. The beta served the king, not the Luna. But his hands were clenched behind his back, and that told her everything. Theron raised his hand, and the hall fell silent. "I have ruled this empire for 11 years, he began, his voice filling the hall the way his presence filled every room he entered, completely, leaving no air for anyone else. I have led in war and governed in peace. I have made decisions that cost me sleep and ones that cost others more." He paused. Leora felt the shift in the room. the held breath of 400 wolves who sensed the change in current. A king must be honest with his people, even when honesty is uncomfortable. He turned to face Leora for the first time that evening. His eyes met hers, and she searched them for something, anything. A flicker of guilt, a shadow of doubt. Some sign that the next words would cost him even a fraction of what they were about to cost her. She found nothing. "By the ancient right of sovereign claim," he said, each word precise and measured, "I dissolve the bond of Luna from Leora Ashvain." The words hit the hall like a physical blow. The collective intake of breath was audible, a sharp hiss of 400 wolves processing the impossible. Murmurs erupted and were silenced by a single raised hand from the king. He crossed to Leora. He was close enough now that she could smell him, cedar and iron, and something underneath that her wolf recognized, with a desperate, keening grief that she would not let reach her face. He reached for the crown. His fingers brushed her hair as he lifted it. The touch lasted less than a second, but she felt it everywhere, a jolt of electricity that raced down her spine and left a hollow ache in its wake. She held his gaze. He didn't flinch, but his throat moved. A single swallow, the only sign. Then he turned away. The rest unfolded exactly as she had imagined it would. Lysara ascending the dais, the crimson gown, the crown settling onto golden hair, the court watching in stunned, captive silence. "You may go," Theron said to Leora, still not looking at her. She didn't answer him. She looked out at the hall, at the hundreds of faces she had served for 3 years, the people whose sick she had tended, whose disputes she had settled, whose names she had memorized because nobody else in this palace bothered to learn them. Then she turned and walked toward the doors. She didn't hurry. She placed each foot deliberately, heel to toe, the way Sylveth had taught her to walk when she was a girl practicing poise with a book balanced on her head. The healer's trick for keeping your body steady when everything inside you was falling apart. She was 3 steps from the door when the floor cracked. The sound was enormous, a deep structural groan that seemed to rise from beneath the foundations themselves. A jagged fissure split the marble from where she stood all the way back to the dais, and the hearth fires flared so bright the room went white for one blinding heartbeat. Leora felt something tear loose inside her chest. Not pain, exactly, but absence. A sudden, staggering emptiness, as though something vital had been ripped from her and she was only now realizing it had been there. She stumbled, caught herself, kept walking. Behind her, the hall dissolved into chaos, but she didn't hear it. She walked through the doors, through the corridor, through the entrance hall, and out into the cold night air. She didn't stop at her chambers, didn't pack a bag, didn't take the lavender or the healing kit or the book of pressed flowers she had been collecting since she was 9 years old. She just walked. The guards at the border gate looked at each other uncertainly but let her pass. She was still technically Luna for a few more hours at least, and no one had told them otherwise. Leora crossed the boundary stones barefoot. She hadn't noticed losing her shoes. Behind her, the ward stones went dark. Not one by one, but all at once. 12 ancient pillars of carved granite that had hummed with protective magic for 600 years fell silent in the span of a single breath. The darkness spread outward from the keep like a wave, racing across the empire faster than any wolf could run. Leora made it half a mile into the forest before her legs gave out. She fell to her knees in the frozen undergrowth, then forward onto her hands, gasping. The emptiness in her chest was expanding, growing teeth, becoming something that consumed rather than merely ached. Her vision blurred. The trees swam. The last thing she saw before darkness swallowed her was a pair of amber eyes watching her from the tree line, and a voice, old and female and unsurprised, saying quietly, "So the Empire finally broke its root bound." The Empire began dying at midnight. In the capital, the royal greenhouses blackened overnight. 300 years of cultivated medicinal herbs, the rarest botanical collection on the continent, withered to ash between sunset and sunrise. The gardeners found them at dawn, standing in rows of black stalks and dust, and wept. In the eastern provinces, wolves woke screaming from a shared nightmare none of them could remember. Dozens reported the same sensation, a snapping in their chest, like a rope pulled too tight, finally breaking. By morning, 6 of them could no longer shift. A wolf who could not shift was a wolf cut off from half their soul. The northern border, protected for generations by an invisible barrier that turned enemy scouts and kept the frost giants on their side of the mountain pass, went dark. Scout commanders sent frantic reports by hawk. Movement in the passes, shapes in the fog. For the first time in living memory, the northern line was exposed. In the keep itself, the remaining 11 wardstones developed fractures, hairline cracks that spread like veins across the ancient granite, visible to anyone who looked. The servants whispered. The guards exchanged glances. Something was wrong with the bones of the world. Theron Valdric noticed none of it at first. He was in his chambers with Lysara, and the night should have felt like triumph. The crown sat on her golden head. The court had witnessed his declaration. Everything he had planned for 6 months had unfolded exactly as intended. But Lysara's perfume was too sweet. Her voice was too bright. And when she lay beside him in the enormous bed, her presence felt hollow, like warmth borrowed from a fire in someone else's room. He couldn't sleep. He lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and told himself it was the adrenaline of the announcement, the weight of a public decision still settling. But there was a hollow in his chest that hadn't been there yesterday, a cavity behind his ribs that pulsed with each heartbeat like a wound that couldn't find its edges. He thought of Leora's face as he'd lifted the crown from her hair. Not the tears he'd expected, not anger or betrayal, or the dramatic collapse he'd braced himself for. Pity. She had looked at him with pity, and the expression had landed somewhere deep and inconvenient, and he could not stop seeing it when he closed his eyes. He pushed the thought away. He'd made the right decision. Leora was a capable administrator, a competent healer, a dutiful Luna in every measurable way. But she was not what an empire needed beside its king. She was not noble-born. She was not politically connected. She did not command rooms or inspire loyalty through presence alone. Lysara did. Lysara was everything Leora was not. Sharp, radiant, ambitious. The daughter of a Western alpha whose alliance would strengthen the Empire's most vulnerable flank. It was strategic. It was necessary. It was done. So why did his chest feel like something inside it had been removed with a dull blade? By morning, the reports began arriving. Jorath delivered them personally, one after another, his expression growing more strained with each parchment he unrolled on the king's desk. The greenhouses, the wolves who couldn't shift, the northern border, the wardstone fractures. Theron read them with the focused intensity of a commander assessing a battlefield, but beneath the surface calm, something cold was spreading through his gut. Coincidence? He asked. Jorath hesitated. That hesitation told Theron more than any report. Speak freely, Theron ordered. I've sent for the archivists, Jorath said carefully. And the keeper of rituals. There are older records regarding the root binding. The mating ritual? It wasn't a mating ritual, Your Majesty. Jorath's voice was quiet, precise, choosing each word like a man walking through a field of buried blades. Or rather, it wasn't only a mating ritual. Theron's jaw tightened. Explain. The root binding selects the Luna based on compatibility with the Empire's wardstone network. The ritual doesn't just bond her to the king, it bonds her to the land. Her life force sustains the protective magic, the barriers, the fertility of the soil, the stability of the shift for every wolf within the borders. The silence that followed was the loudest sound Theron had ever heard. She's been sustaining all of it? He asked, his voice dangerously low. For 3 years, Your Majesty. Every morning when she walked the ward stones, she was pouring herself into them. It wasn't symbolic. It was literal. And no one told her? Jarath looked uncomfortable. No one alive understood what the ritual actually did. The last root-bound Luna served 200 years ago. The knowledge was buried in archives no one reads. Theron stood. The chair scraped against the stone floor with a sharp, grating screech. He crossed to the window and looked out at the courtyard below. The fountain, which had run with clear water for as long as anyone could remember, was dry. The basin was cracked. The cold thing in his gut was spreading to his hands, his throat, the backs of his eyes. "Where is she?" he asked without turning around. Another hesitation. Longer, this time. "She crossed the border 12 hours ago, Your Majesty. On foot. Without an escort." Theron's fist hit the window frame. The wood splintered, and pain flared across his knuckles, sharp and grounding and completely inadequate. "She had no shoes," Jorath added quietly. "The gate guard said she wasn't wearing shoes." The image landed like a hammer to the chest. Leora, barefoot in the frozen forest, walking away from everything she had served for 3 years because he had told her to go. Not dragged, not escorted. She had simply walked out, straight-backed and steady, with more dignity in her exit than he had shown in his entire reign. And he had let her. Meanwhile, deep in the forest beyond the border, Leora woke to warmth. She was lying on a narrow cot in a cabin so small the walls seemed to lean inward like concerned relatives. A fire crackled in a stone hearth. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling in dense, fragrant clusters. The air smelled of chamomile and wood smoke, and something older, earthier, that she couldn't name. "Don't try to sit up yet," a voice said. Leora turned her head. An elderly woman sat beside the fire, her silver hair braided in a thick rope over one shoulder, her face a landscape of deep lines and sharp, intelligent eyes the color of autumn bark. "Where am I?" Leora asked. Her voice came out cracked and thin. "My home. You collapsed about 30 paces from my front door, which was either very lucky or very deliberate on the part of whatever force dragged you out here." The woman stood and crossed to the cot, pressing the back of her hand against Leora's forehead. "My name is Marin. I'm a healer. Or I was, before I decided I preferred trees to politics." "How long was I unconscious?" "Through the night. Your body was in shock." Marin paused, studying her with an intensity that made Leora feel like an open book. "Do you know what you are, child?" Leora blinked. "I'm a healer. Or I was. I was also the Luna. But I suppose I'm not that anymore either." Marin shook her head slowly. "You're a root-bound, the rarest form of Luna the old magic can produce. Your soul was bonded to the Empire's wardstone network during the root-binding ritual. Every morning when you walked those stones, you were feeding them your own life force. You've been the living anchor of the Valdric Empire for 3 years." The words landed one by one, each hitting harder than the last. Leora stared at the old woman, waiting for the caveat, the misunderstanding, the part where this turned out to be a mistake. It didn't come. "They didn't tell me," Leora whispered. "They didn't know," Marin said. "The knowledge has been lost for 2 centuries. But I've read the old texts. I've studied the original rituals." She sat on the edge of the cot. "You've been pouring yourself into that empire drop by drop for 3 years, child. You kept their borders sealed. You kept their crops growing. You kept every wolf in the territory anchored to their shift." She paused. "And they repaid you by putting a crown on another woman's head." The tears came then, not the quiet, controlled kind she had perfected over 3 years of silent heartbreak. These were ugly and raw, torn from somewhere deep, and they burned. Marin didn't touch her, didn't offer empty comfort. She simply sat beside her and waited, and when the worst of it had passed, she said, "The Empire is already dying without you. The ward stones are fracturing. The barriers are failing. Within 7 days, the damage will be irreversible." Leora pressed her palms against her eyes. "Good," she said, and the word tasted like ash and vindication and grief all at once. "You don't mean that," Marin observed. Leora wanted to argue, wanted to say yes. She did mean it, that the Empire that had used her and discarded her deserved whatever came next. But she thought of the servants who had loved her, the healers in the lower city, who counted on wardstone-protected supply routes, the children in the border villages who slept safely because the barriers held. She pressed her face into the thin pillow and said nothing. Back in the capital, Jorath stood before the king's desk with one final piece of information he had been saving, because delivering it required the particular courage of a man who understood he might not leave the room intact. "There's one more thing, Your Majesty," Jorath said. Theron looked up. His eyes were bloodshot. His knuckles were swollen and dark with bruising. He had not changed out of last night's clothes. Behind him, through the window, the dry fountain basin was visible like an accusation. "The archivists found a passage in the oldest root-binding texts," Jorath continued, "regarding the severing of a root-bound bond. And?" Jorath took a breath. "If the root-bound is not restored within 7 days of severance, the Empire's wardstone network collapses permanently. No future Luna, root-bound or otherwise, will be able to reactivate it. The barriers, the fertility enchantments, the shift stability, all of it gone. Permanently." Theron stared at him. "She's been gone 12 hours, Your Majesty. And if you don't find her and convince her to return within 7 days, the Empire won't just tremble." Jorath set a crumbling piece of wardstone on the desk. Dust fell from it like gray snow. "It will fall." Theron rode out at dawn on the second day. He told Jorath it was strategic. The Empire was crumbling and only the rootbound could restore it, and the rootbound needed to be found and persuaded to return. It was a matter of national survival. Nothing more. Jorath had simply nodded and said nothing, which was his particular way of calling Theron a liar without using words. Theron took 3 riders with him and left Lysara in the capital with a kiss on her forehead and instructions to manage the court in his absence. She had smiled and wished him luck, her fingers trailing along his jaw in a gesture that should have felt intimate, but instead felt like someone running their hand along a possession they were checking for damage. He didn't notice. He was already halfway to the door. The bond pulled him east. He hadn't expected that. The root binding was supposed to be political, ceremonial, a formality required by tradition. Nobody had told him it would feel like a fishhook buried behind his sternum, dragging him toward a woman he had spent 3 years pretending didn't affect him. But the further he rode from the capital and the closer he got to wherever Leora had gone, the more the hollow in his chest eased, and the more a different kind of pain replaced it. Guilt. The slow, corrosive kind that ate through every justification he had built. The Empire was dying around him as he rode. He saw it in the fields, crops that should have been green with early spring growth, standing brown and brittle. He saw it in the villages, wolves who moved too slowly, who flinched when they should have been steady, whose eyes carried a dullness that had nothing to do with exhaustion. In one small settlement, a young mother stood outside her home holding a child who was wailing inconsolably, and when Theron passed, she looked at him with an expression he couldn't categorize until he was a mile past. Accusation. She didn't know what he'd done. None of them did. Not yet. But they felt it. Every wolf in the Empire felt the absence of whatever Leora had been giving them, even if they couldn't name it. He found the cabin on the 3rd day. It sat at the edge of a ravine in forest so dense the canopy blocked most of the sky. Smoke rose from a crooked chimney. Herbs hung drying from every available surface. A woman he didn't recognize stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and an expression that suggested she had been expecting him and wasn't impressed. "Marin," he guessed. "Your Majesty," the old healer replied, making the title sound like a diagnosis. "I need to see Leora." "She doesn't want to see you." The words landed harder than they should have. Theron dismounted and took a step forward. Marin didn't move. She was half his size and roughly 4 times his age, and she blocked the doorway with the immovable certainty of a woman who had stopped being afraid of kings long before this particular king was born. "The Empire is dying," Theron said. "Yes," Marin agreed. "It is. She's the only one who can stop it." "Also true. Then let me speak with her." Marin studied him for a long moment, her amber eyes sharp and assessing. Then she stepped aside, not because he'd convinced her, but because a voice from inside the cabin said, "Let him in, Marin. He can say whatever he came to say." Theron ducked through the low doorway and stopped. Leora sat on the edge of the narrow cot, wrapped in a wool blanket that swallowed her frame. She was pale, thinner than he remembered, though he realized with a sickening lurch that he didn't remember clearly at all. He had spent 3 years not looking at her, and now that he was forced to, he couldn't reconcile the woman in front of him with the ghost he'd been carrying in his peripheral vision. Her dark hair was loose around her shoulders. Her hands were folded in her lap, steady but thin, the veins visible beneath her skin. She looked fragile in a way she never had before, and a sharp, unfamiliar ache lodged itself behind his sternum. She didn't stand when he entered, didn't bow, didn't offer any of the courtesies she had performed flawlessly for 3 years. She just looked at him and waited. "Leora," he began. "The Empire needs me," she interrupted, her voice flat and precise. "I know." Marin explained what I am, what I was doing all those mornings at the Wardstones. Theron nodded slowly. "Did you know?" she asked. The question was quiet, but it cut like a blade. "When you removed the crown, when you told me to go, did you know what I was sustaining?" "No," he said. "I didn't." Would it have changed anything? The question hung between them like a held breath. Theron opened his mouth to say yes, of course. He would never have severed the bond if he'd known, but the words died before they reached his tongue because she would know if he was lying. The bond ensured that, and the truth was more complicated than yes. The truth was that he had treated her as disposable regardless of what she sustained, and whether or not he knew about the Wardstones didn't change the fundamental cruelty of what he'd done. "I don't know," he said finally. Something shifted in her expression. Not softening, not forgiveness, but a grim kind of respect for the honesty. "Then we have nothing to discuss," she said. "Go save your empire some other way." "There is no other way. The archivists confirmed it. Only the rootbound can restore the network. If the Wardstones collapse permanently, the barriers fall, the northern border opens. Every wolf in the territory loses anchor to their shift. Thousands will suffer." "Thousands already suffered," Leora said quietly. "They just didn't notice because the person absorbing the cost was invisible." The words hit him like a closed fist. He had no answer for them because they were true. "Leora, please." She stood. The blanket fell from her shoulders, and he saw how thin her arms had become, how her collarbone jutted sharply beneath her skin. She crossed to the window, her back to him, and for a moment the only sound was the fire crackling and the wind moving through the trees outside. "I gave everything to that empire," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every morning, every Wardstone, every hour I spent tending people who would watch me be humiliated and say nothing." She pressed her hand against the window frame. "I gave everything, and you put a crown on another woman's head and told me to go." "I know," Theron said, and the words came out broken. "Then you know why I can't just come back because you asked." The silence that followed was interrupted by a sound from outside. A sharp crack, like ice breaking. Leora gasped and doubled over, her hands flying to her chest. Theron lunged forward on instinct, catching her before she hit the floor. She was shaking, her face drained of color, her breathing ragged and shallow. "What's happening?" he demanded, turning to Marin, who had rushed inside. The old healer pressed her hand against Leora's forehead, then her chest, then pulled back with an expression that made Theron's blood run cold. "The ward stones," Marin said grimly. "Another one just fractured. The network is collapsing faster now." She looked at Theron, and for the first time her composure cracked. "The bond was never fully severed, Your Majesty. It can't be. Not while she lives. As the Empire dies, she dies with it." Theron looked down at the woman in his arms, unconscious now, her pulse fluttering beneath his fingers like a trapped bird. He had sent her away to be rid of her, and instead, he had sentenced her to die with the Empire he was destroying. Leora woke to firelight and the smell of cedar. The smell confused her. Cedar wasn't one of Marin's herbs. Cedar was the smell of polished wood and cold stone hallways, and a palace she never wanted to think about again. Cedar was the smell of him. She turned her head and found Theron sitting on the floor beside the cot, his back against the wall, his legs drawn up, his head resting on his folded arms. He was asleep. She stared at him, disoriented. The king of the Valdric Empire was sleeping on the floor of a hermit's cabin in the middle of a forest, and the sheer absurdity of it almost made her laugh. Almost. But then she remembered the pain, the sharp, splintering sensation in her chest, like a bone cracking from the inside. She pressed her hand against her sternum and felt a dull, persistent ache radiating outward. "He hasn't moved in 6 hours," Marin said from across the room. The old healer was grinding something at her small work table, the pestle scraping against the mortar in a steady rhythm. "Carried you to the cot, sat down on the floor, and hasn't left your side since." "He's the king," Leora murmured. "He has an empire to save." "He seems to think he has something more important to save right here." Leora closed her eyes. She didn't want to feel what those words made her feel. She had spent 3 years building walls against exactly this kind of hope, and she couldn't afford to let them crack now. "How bad is it?" she asked instead. Marin set down the pestle. "The truth? Always. 4 ward stones have fractured since you left. The network is cascading. Each failure puts more strain on the remaining stones, which accelerates their collapse." She paused. "And because the bond between you and the network was never cleanly severed, each fracture is pulling life force from you. Your body is trying to sustain stones that are hundreds of miles away and crumbling." "How long do I have?" "If the remaining stones hold, weeks perhaps. If the cascade continues at this rate," Marin hesitated, "days." The word settled over Leora like a shroud. She absorbed it quietly, the way she had absorbed every blow life had delivered. Quietly, completely, without complaint. "Can she restore the network from here?" Theron's voice came from the floor, rough with sleep and something rawer. Leora startled. She hadn't realized he was awake. He lifted his head, and she saw his face clearly for the first time since the ball. He looked wrecked. The composed, granite-jawed king she had lived beside for 3 years was gone. In his place was a man with bloodshot eyes and hollowed cheeks, and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to set itself into anything other than anguish. "No," Marin replied. "The restoration requires physical contact with the central wardstone at the keep. And even then, it will only work if the bond is whole." She looked between them. "The root binding connects the Luna to the land through the king. If the bond between you two remains fractured, the wardstones can't accept her life force. She could lay her hands on every stone in the Empire and nothing would happen." The implication settled into the room like smoke. "The bond isn't fractured," Theron said quietly. "I dissolved the Luna title. I didn't dissolve the bond itself." "You humiliated her in front of 400 people and replaced her with another woman," Marin said with the gentle brutality of someone who had stopped caring about diplomacy decades ago. The title is a formality. The bond is built on trust. What do you imagine you did to her trust, Your Majesty? Theron flinched. Leora watched the flinch and felt nothing. Or told herself she felt nothing. The truth was more complicated, tangled up in the ache in her chest that was partly Wardstone collapse and partly something older and more personal. Leora, Theron said, turning to face her fully. He shifted onto his knees beside the cot, and the vulnerability in the gesture, this enormous, powerful man kneeling on a dirt floor, made something crack behind her carefully constructed walls. I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it. Not as your king, not as the man who hurt you. Just hear it. She said nothing. She didn't tell him to speak or to stop. She just waited. I chose Lysara because she was safe, he said, and each word sounded like it was being pulled from him by force. Not politically, not strategically. He closed his eyes. Emotionally. She was safe because I felt nothing for her. She was beautiful and ambitious and transactional, and being with her required nothing of me, no vulnerability, no risk. He opened his eyes and looked at her, and what she saw in his expression was so raw, it made her breath catch. You terrified me, he said, from the first day. The way you looked at me, the way you cared about everything and everyone. The way you left flowers on my desk that I pretended not to see because if I acknowledged them, I would have to acknowledge what they meant and what I felt when I found them. And I was not prepared to feel that. Leora's vision blurred. She blinked hard against the tears. You were never invisible to me, he continued, his voice fracturing. I saw you every single day. I saw you walk the wardstones at dawn. I saw you learn every servant's name. I saw you sitting across from me at dinner, trying so hard to reach me, and I let you believe you were failing because it was easier than admitting you'd already succeeded. A tear slid down Leora's cheek. She didn't wipe it away. You chose easier, she whispered. And it cost me everything. I know. I was abandoned as an infant thereon, left on the steps of a healing house with nothing but a name sewn into a blanket. I spent my entire life earning my place, proving I was worth keeping. And you stood in front of 400 people and proved that I wasn't. His face crumbled. The granite finally, completely gave way, and what was underneath was grief so profound, it filled the tiny cabin like a physical presence. You were always worth keeping, he said, the words so quiet they almost dissolved before reaching her. I was the one who wasn't worthy. Of you. Of any of it. Marin had left the cabin at some point. Leora hadn't noticed when. The fire crackled. The wind pressed against the walls. And in the silence between them, something shifted. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But the first tentative crack in a wall that had been mortared with 3 years of loneliness and sealed with public humiliation. Leora reached out and touched his face. His eyes closed. His hand came up to cover hers, pressing her palm against his cheek, and a shudder ran through him so violent she felt it in her own bones. I'm not forgiving you, she said quietly. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. I know, he whispered. But I won't let the Empire's people die for what you did to me. They don't deserve that. He turned his face into her palm, and she felt the warmth of his breath against her skin and the dampness of tears he would never admit to in daylight. The moment shattered with the sound of hoofbeats. Marin burst through the door, her expression sharp with alarm. Riders approaching, fast, from the west. Theron was on his feet instantly, the grieving man replaced by the commander in the space of a single breath. He crossed to the window and looked out. Those aren't my riders, he said, his voice dropping to something cold and dangerous. A hawk landed on the windowsill as if summoned. Theron untied the message from its leg with steady hands and read it. Leora watched the color drain from his face. What is it? she asked. He looked at her, and the expression in his eyes was something she had never seen before. Not fear. Beyond fear. It's from Jorath. Lysara's father, Lord Aldrich Dane, has mobilized the Western Pack. 12,000 wolves marching on the capital. He set the message down carefully, the way you set down something that might explode. The barriers are down. There's nothing between them and the throne. The realization crashed over Leora like cold water. She planned this. Every moment of it, Theron said, and his voice held the terrible flatness of a man watching every decision he'd ever made rearrange itself into a pattern he should have seen from the beginning. The seduction, the whispers against you, the public humiliation. She needed me to sever the root-bound bond specifically because it would collapse the barriers. Lysara Dane hadn't been a mistress. She had been a siege weapon, and Theron had aimed her at his own walls. They rode for the capital at first light. Leora shouldn't have been on a horse. She knew it. Marin knew it. The old healer had argued, pleaded, and finally resorted to standing in front of the cabin door with her arms spread wide and a look of absolute maternal fury on her face. "You can barely stand," Marin had said. "Every ward stone that cracks takes another piece of you with it. If you ride hard for 2 days, you might not survive the journey, let alone the restoration." "If I don't ride, the Empire falls and I die anyway," Leora had replied. "At least this way, I choose how it ends." Marin had stared at her for a long moment. Then she'd pressed a pouch of herbs into Leora's hand and said, "You are spectacularly stubborn. You have until dawn tomorrow at best. After that, even the central stone won't have enough left to restore." "I learned from the best," Leora had answered. And then they rode. Theron kept his horse close to hers, close enough to catch her if she swayed. She hated that she needed him to. She hated more that his proximity steadied her, that the bond between them, fractured and bruised as it was, still hummed when he was near. She could feel his pulse in her own chest when he rode beside her, could feel the warmth of his presence like sunlight on skin that had been cold for too long. She didn't tell him this. She wasn't ready to give him that. They rode through dying countryside, fields of ash-gray crops, villages where wolves stood in doorways with hollow eyes, watching the king pass with expressions that ranged from desperate hope to bitter accusation. A child ran alongside them for a quarter mile, calling out, "Are you going to fix it? My mother can't shift anymore. She cries every night." Theron's hands tightened on the reins until his knuckles went white. He didn't answer the child because there was nothing honest he could say. On the second morning, Leora woke in their makeshift camp to find frost on her blanket and blood on her pillow. She wiped her mouth quickly before Theron could see, but Marin's herbs were losing their hold. Each hour brought a new wardstone failure, and each failure carved another piece from her. She could feel them now, the remaining stones, like phantom limbs across the landscape. 7 still stood. She could sense their locations, their fractures, their desperate attempt to sustain a network that was collapsing around them. They were screaming for her, and she couldn't reach them yet. They were half a day from the capital when the Western Pack found them. The riders emerged from the tree line without warning, 30 wolves in battle formation, moving with the disciplined precision of soldiers who had been waiting for exactly this moment. At their center, mounted on a white mare with silver tack that caught the morning light, rode Lysara Dane. She had traded the crimson gown for riding leathers and a fur-lined cloak, but the Luna's crown still sat on her golden head. She wore it like a trophy. "Theron!" Lysara called out, her voice carrying across the clearing with practiced ease. "I was hoping to find you on the road. It saves me the trouble of a siege." Theron positioned his horse between Lysara and Leora, with a movement so instinctive Leora doubted he was even aware of it. "Call off your father's army, Lysara," he said. His voice was the voice he used in council, the one that turned men to stone. Lysara's smile was radiant, patient. the smile of a woman who had already won and was simply waiting for everyone else to realize it. My father's army is already at the gates, darling. 12,000 wolves against a garrison that can barely shift. Your barriers are dust, your ward stones are rubble, and your real Luna. Her gaze shifted to Leora, and the smile sharpened, is dying. How long have you known? Theron asked. About the root bound. About what severing the bond would do. Lysara tilted her head, a gesture she'd perfected in 6 months of courtship. My father's scholars found the records years ago. The root binding isn't just a romantic tradition, Theron. It's the single structural weakness of the Valdric Empire. Destroy the Luna, destroy the barriers. It was simply a matter of finding the right lever. She looked at him with something approaching tenderness. You were very easy to manipulate, you know. All I had to do was be everything she wasn't. Leora watched Theron absorb the words. Watched the realization settle over him like a landslide, slow at first, then all at once. Every whispered conversation, every carefully placed doubt about Leora's suitability, every evening Lysara had spent in his chambers, not out of desire, but out of strategy. He had been played, completely, methodically, and devastatingly played. The humiliation was necessary, Lysara continued, her tone conversational, as though discussing weather. It had to be public. The root-bound bond is anchored in the Luna's sense of belonging. A private dismissal might not have damaged the bond enough, but standing her in front of the entire court, removing the crown from her head, placing it on mine, she gestured to the circlet in her hair. That ensured the bond shattered completely. Leora felt the words hit Theron through their connection, not anger. Something worse. The sickening, bottomless horror of a man realizing he had been the weapon used against everything he was supposed to protect. You used me, he said, and his voice held no fury, just the hollow devastation of absolute clarity. You used yourself, Lysara corrected. I simply pointed you in the right direction. The clearing was silent. Lysara's riders held formation, patient and disciplined. Theron's 3 guards had their hands on their weapons, but 30-3 were not odds that favored heroism. Then Leora dismounted. Her legs nearly buckled. She caught herself against the horse's flank and straightened, breathing through the pain in her chest. Theron turned sharply. Leora, don't. She ignored him. She walked forward, past Theron's horse, into the open space between the 2 groups. Lysara watched her approach, with the amused curiosity of a cat observing something small and struggling. You engineered all of this, Leora said. Her voice was thin but steady. The seduction, the humiliation, the collapse. She stopped 10 paces from Lysara's horse. But you missed something. Lysara's smile flickered. And what would that be? Leora pressed her hand against the frozen ground. She didn't know what she was doing, not consciously, but something deeper than thought was moving through her, something ancient and instinctive that recognized the soil beneath her fingers, the way a mother recognizes her child's cry. The land knew her. Even here, beyond the borders, the roots of the Wardstone network reached deep, and they remembered who had fed them for 3 years. The ground pulsed, a single beat, like a heart restarting, and a wave of golden light raced outward from Leora's palm in every direction. It moved through the earth like ripples through water, and where it passed, the dead grass turned green. The frozen topsoil thawed. The air itself seemed to warm. Lysara's horse reared. 3 of her riders broke formation, their mounts panicking. Lysara gripped her reins with white-knuckled hands, her composure cracking for the first time. That's not possible, she breathed. You're severed. The bond is broken. The bond isn't in the crown, Leora said, and blood was running from her nose now, warm against her lip. It's in every morning I walked those stones, every drop I gave. 3 years of my life poured into that land. You can't sever that with a ceremony and a speech. The light faded. Leora swayed. And then she fell. Theron was off his horse before she touched the earth, dismounting so fast the movement was a blur. He gathered her against his chest, one arm under her shoulders, the other cradling her head, and the sound he made was not a word. It was something more primal, a sound from the wolf, not the king. Lysara's riders had regrouped, but their formation was uneasy now. Several wolves were staring at the green grass spreading in a circle from where Leora had knelt, their expressions shifting from discipline to doubt. The stones, Leora whispered against Theron's chest. Her voice was barely a breath. I need to reach the central wardstone at the keep. If I can touch it, I can restore the network. You'll die before you get there, Theron said, his voice cracking. Then ride faster. He looked down at her, at the blood on her face and the steel in her eyes, and something in his expression resolved into a certainty she had never seen in him before. Not the cold certainty of a king making a strategic decision. Something fiercer, something desperate and personal and absolute. He stood, lifting her with him, and turned to face Lysara. Move, he said, and the word carried the full weight of the alpha command, the kind that pressed against the bones of every wolf in earshot and demanded submission. Lysara's riders flinched. Two of them took involuntary steps backward. Even Lysara's horse shifted beneath her, but Lysara herself held firm, her jaw set, her eyes blazing. You don't get to command me, Theron. Not anymore. I wasn't commanding you, Theron said. He placed Leora on his horse with a gentleness that contradicted everything about the violence coiled in his body, then mounted behind her, wrapping one arm around her waist. I was warning you. He drove his heels into the horse's flanks and rode directly at Lysara's line. 3 of her riders broke. The rest parted like water around a stone, and Theron and Leora thundered through the gap and onto the road toward the capital. Behind them, Lysara screamed an order. Hoofbeats erupted in pursuit. Ahead of them, the capital waited. The wardstones waited. And if Marin was right, dawn was all they had. They reached the capital gates as the sky turned from black to the bruised purple of early dawn. Leora was barely conscious. She rode slumped against Theron's chest, his arm the only thing keeping her upright, her breathing shallow and irregular. He could feel her pulse against his forearm where it wrapped around her waist, and it was too fast, too light, a flutter where there should have been a steady beat. The capital was in chaos. Smoke rose from the western quarter where skirmishes had already broken out between the garrison and Aldrich Dane's advance scouts. Wolves ran through the streets carrying weapons, carrying children, carrying whatever they could hold. The air smelled of fear and ash. Jorath met them at the inner gate, his face grim, his armor streaked with dust. His eyes widened when he saw Leora. Is she? She's alive, Theron said. Where is the central wardstone? The courtyard. But Theron. Jorath gripped the horse's bridle. Dane's forces breached the outer wall an hour ago. We're holding the second perimeter, but I have maybe 2,000 wolves who can still shift properly. The rest are compromised. We can't hold for long. We won't need long, Theron said. He dismounted carefully, cradling Leora against his chest. She weighed almost nothing. The woman who had carried the weight of an empire for 3 years weighed almost nothing in his arms, and the thought made something inside him fracture in a way he knew would never fully heal. He carried her through corridors he had walked 10,000 times without seeing, past the portrait hall, where paintings of former Lunas watched from gilded frames, past the council chamber where he had made the decision to court Lysara, past the doorway to the sewing room where he had laced another woman into Leora's dress, while Leora stood in the corridor with her heart breaking, and he hadn't even known she was there. He knew now. He would know for the rest of his life. The central wardstone stood in the inner courtyard, the oldest and largest of the 12. It rose from the cobblestones like a monument, 8 feet of ancient granite carved with symbols so old their meaning had been lost centuries ago. Fractures ran through it like veins, glowing faintly with dying light. Theron knelt and set Leora down at its base, her back resting against the stone. Her eyes opened, unfocused, searching. "I'm here," he said. "You're here. The wardstone is right behind you." She reached back and pressed her palm against the granite. A shudder ran through the stone, through the ground, through Theron's knees. He felt it in his chest, a resonance, like 2 heartbeats trying to synchronize. "It's not enough," Leora whispered. Her hand trembled against the stone. "The bond. It's still fractured. The stone can feel me, but it can't accept what I'm giving." Marin's words echoed in his mind. "The root binding connects the Luna to the land through the king. If the bond between you two remains fractured, the wardstones can't accept her life force. The bond was built on trust, and he had obliterated hers." "Leora," he said, "tell me what you need." She looked at him, and her eyes were clear despite the pain, luminous, the eyes of a woman who had been underestimated by everyone who had ever known her, including the man who was supposed to know her best. "I need you to mean it," she said. "Not because the Empire is falling. Not because I'm the only one who can save it. Not because you're afraid of what happens if you lose." Her voice cracked, but she held his gaze. "I need you to choose me because you want to. Because I am enough. Just me. Without the wardstones. Without the crown. Without any of it." The sounds of battle drifted over the walls. Steel on steel. Wolves howling. The Empire tearing itself apart around them. And in the center of it all, a woman who had been told her entire life that she existed to be useful was asking to be wanted for something other than what she could provide. Theron took her free hand. "When you left flowers on my desk," he said, and his voice broke on the second word and he kept going anyway. "I took them. Every time. I pressed them in the pages of my journal because I couldn't bear to throw them away, and I couldn't bear to admit why." A tear slid down his face. He didn't wipe it. "When you learned every servant's name, I watched you do it and felt ashamed because I hadn't bothered to learn a single one. When you sat across from me at dinner, I looked away, because looking at you made me feel things I had decided a king couldn't afford to feel." He brought her hand to his lips, pressing his mouth against her knuckles. "I don't choose you because you can save the Empire," he said. "I choose you because you're the only person who ever made me want to be worth saving myself." The wardstone flared. Golden light erupted from the fractures, so bright it turned the courtyard to noon. Leora gasped, her back arching against the stone as the light poured through her and into the granite and outward, racing along invisible lines beneath the earth like fire along a fuse. Theron felt the bond snap into place. Not gently. It was a collision, a detonation. 2 broken things slamming together so hard the impact left him breathless. He felt her, felt everything. Her pain, her exhaustion, her grief. Her stubborn, relentless, terrifying capacity to love despite everything that had been done to her. And beneath it all, warm and steady and unshakable, her trust. Fragile and new and offered not because he deserved it, but because she chose to give it. The way she had always chosen to give. Freely, completely, without guarantee of return. The wardstones across the Empire blazed to life. Every remaining pillar of ancient granite erupted in golden light simultaneously, and where stones had crumbled, the light burst from the earth itself, raw and uncontained. The barriers reformed, visible for the first time in generations, shimmering walls of translucent energy that rose from the border stones and climbed into the sky. The northern pass sealed, the western border solidified. And Aldrich Dane's 12,000 wolves, mid-assault on the second perimeter, felt the shift beneath their feet, and the sudden crushing weight of a Wardstone network restored to full power by a Luna who had never stopped sustaining it, even when it cost her everything. The invading wolves couldn't hold their shifted forms. One by one they stumbled, collapsed, reverted. The barriers pressed against them like a living thing, recognizing the threat, rejecting it. Within minutes, the assault broke apart. In the courtyard, Leora slumped forward into Theron's arms. He caught her, held her, pulled her so tightly against his chest that he could feel her heartbeat against his own. Steady now. Strong. "Did it work?" she murmured against his shoulder. The wardstone behind her hummed, warm and whole and alive with light. "It worked," he said. "You did it." She smiled, small and exhausted and real, and then she passed out in his arms. But this time, her breathing was deep and even. This time, her pulse was strong. This time, she was sleeping. Not dying. Sleeping. Theron held her in the courtyard while dawn broke over the capital, and for the first time in his reign, the Alpha King wept. The restoration didn't fix everything overnight. The crops took weeks to recover. The wolves who had lost their shift regained it slowly, painfully, one transformation at a time. The wardstones held, but 3 of the 12 needed to be recarved from new granite, and the stonemasons worked around the clock for a month. Lysara Dane was brought before the court in chains. She stood where Leora had stood on the night of the ball, in the center of the great hall, surrounded by the same 400 faces. She did not look graceful in defeat. She looked exactly like what she was, a strategist whose gambit had failed. Theron offered her a choice that was more mercy than she deserved. Exile or judgment. She chose exile, and no one mourned her departure. Lord Aldrich Dane's western pack was stripped of its territory and absorbed into the crown's direct governance. The scholars who had discovered the root-bound vulnerability and weaponized it were tried and sentenced. The records were not destroyed. Leora insisted they be preserved and made accessible so that no future Luna would serve in ignorance of what she was giving. The court's reaction to Leora's return was complicated. A foundling healer, publicly humiliated and discarded, now restored as Luna with power no one had understood, was not a comfortable narrative for people who preferred their hierarchies clean and their queens well-born. But Leora had never needed their comfort. She had spent 3 years earning their respect one name at a time, one healed wound at a time, one quiet act of service at a time, and that, it turned out, was a foundation that no amount of court politics could undermine. Months later, Leora woke in the pale light of early morning. The wardstones hummed softly beyond the window, steady and warm, sustained not by sacrifice, but by the bond she shared with the land and the man sleeping beside her. Theron's arm was draped across her waist. His breathing was deep and even. His face, in sleep, held none of the granite severity of the king. He looked younger, softer, like a man who had finally set down something impossibly heavy and discovered that his hands still worked. Leora watched him for a moment. Then she rose quietly, dressed, and walked the wardstones at dawn. Not because she had to, because she chose to. The stones hummed beneath her palms, warm and grateful and alive, and Leora smiled, and the empire held.